What would you do if silence could save your life, but speaking could save your people? She had no army, no throne by blood, no guarantee she would survive the day. She only had a choice: stay hidden and safe, or step into the fire for the sake of others. She was Esther, and with nothing but her faith and her courage, she changed the fate of an entire nation. This is the story of the silent warrior, the hidden queen, the woman who risked everything for such a time as this. Before she wore a crown, before she was called queen, she was Hadassah, a name as delicate as the leaves of the myrtle tree and just as resilient. Hadassah was born into exile, her tiny cries first echoing not in the land of her ancestors, but in the shadow of a foreign empire. Persia, with its towering palaces and gilded idols, was a world away from the covenant promises given to Abraham. Here, among a scattered and often scorned people, Hadassah grew. She was not born into privilege, but into loss. The Bible says little, but what it does say speaks volumes. She had neither father nor mother. Orphaned young, her life from the start was a story of survival. Mordecai, her cousin, stepped into the silence left by her parents. He took her into his home, into his heart, raising her not as a distant relative but as his own daughter. In a ESI world where women were often seen but rarely heard, Hadassah learned early how to listen, how to observe, how to carry herself with quiet dignity. She grew up under the heavy banners of Persian conquest, in the crowded streets of Susa, a city where power could shift with the flick of a wrist, and life was measured in whispers. In Susa, everything had a price: loyalty, beauty, truth. The palace gleamed like a promise, but it was a promise wrapped in danger. Queens were chosen for their faces, not their voices. Girls were groomed not to rule, but to adorn. Hadassah, tucked away in the lower quarters, would have seen it all: the pageants of wealth parading through marble courtyards, the clatter of soldiers' boots echoing against stone walls, the murmurs of intrigue floating on the desert wind. Her Jewish heritage was a secret folded tightly into her daily life. Persia tolerated many gods, many customs, but Jews were a people apart, a thread that would not weave itself into the imperial tapestry. Mordecai, wise and cautious, would have taught her to be careful, to blend when necessary, but never to forget who she was. Identity was both armor and liability. It could save her, it could destroy her. Hadassah learned how to move unseen, how to walk with grace, to speak with measured words, to hold her true self close to her heart like a hidden flame. She was raised not to seek attention, but to survive attention when it came. In the swirling dangers of the Persian court, invisibility was safety, and Hadassah was a master of survival long before she ever wore royal robes. But destiny does not always honor safety, and silence is not always enough. The day came when the king's decree tore through Susa like a hot desert wind. Vashti, the queen, had been cast aside for defiance. The court demanded a replacement, not a leader, not a partner, but a jewel. The most beautiful virgins in the empire were to be gathered, prepared, presented before the king. Their futures no longer their own. Hadassah did not volunteer. She was taken. One day she was Hadassah, moving through familiar streets, cautious but free. The next, she was swept into the gilded cages of the palace, her identity stripped away. They gave her a new name: Esther, a star, a symbol to shine among the polished stones of the king's harem. It was a name of concealment, of adaptation, a name to survive under. Inside the walls of the palace, life became a theater. 12 months of preparation, 6 with oils, 6 with perfumes. A regimented transformation where skin was polished but souls were forgotten. Each girl taught to please, to adorn, to entertain. Esther endured the training, but she did not lose herself in it. Beneath the layers of myrrh and saffron, she remained Hadassah, watchful, silent, enduring. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was not beauty alone that set her apart. It was favor, a mysterious grace that caught the eye of Haggai, the eunuch in charge, and later the king himself. Favor is a strange thing. It cannot be taught, bought, or manufactured. It either rests upon you or it does not. For Esther, it was the thread God had woven through her survival from the beginning. When her moment came, she asked for nothing extra, no special adornment. She stood before the king clothed in simplicity and strength, and the king loved her more than all the others. A crown, heavy with jewels and expectations, was set upon her head. A foreign orphan became the queen of Persia, but the crown was not. Freedom, it was a heavier burden. Her identity remained hidden, her life balanced on a blade. She had risen higher than she could have imagined, but she stood on a foundation of secrets. In that towering palace of wealth and whispers, Esther lived between two worlds, the seen and the unseen, the known and the concealed. She became a hidden star, burning brightly but quietly, waiting for a time when light would no longer be a luxury but a necessity for survival. And somewhere deep within her heart, behind the silks and the smiles, Hadassah remained, silent, patient, ready. The palace was dazzling, but for Esther it was a world built on silence. She walked marble halls lined with golden carvings, her every step cushioned by layers of luxury, yet she moved like a ghost among the living. Servants bowed, nobles gossiped, courtiers schemed, and Esther, the hidden star, learned to shine without revealing her light. She had no counsel of her own, no power of decree. Her crown was an ornament, not a weapon. Her survival depended not on force, but on obedience. A dangerous dance of appearing perfect while hiding the truth beneath layers of royal silk. In the eyes of the empire, she was simply another beautiful queen, chosen for her face, paraded for her grace, silenced by expectation. In this kingdom, a woman's worth was measured by her appearance, not her allegiance. Esther knew this. She knew that one wrong word, one misstep, could not only cost her life but betray her people, who remained scattered, exiled, vulnerable. She was a queen without a throne of her own, a wife whose voice could not echo beyond the marble walls, unless summoned by the king's whim. Still, Esther watched. She listened. Every day, behind veils of perfumes and politics, she gathered what scraps of knowledge she could. News from the outer courts, whispers carried by trembling servants, reports smuggled from the streets. She heard of unrest, ambition, and greed. She understood that power in Persia shifted, not through armies alone, but through whispers behind closed doors. She understood, too, that silence was sometimes louder than speech. Every day she remained unseen. She was choosing survival, not only for herself, but for all those whose fate was unknowingly tied to hers. Then came Haman, a man of sharp ambition and poisoned pride. Haman rose faster than any courtier before him. King Xerxes, blind with trust, or perhaps simply drunk with indifference, elevated him above all other nobles. And Haman, in his pride, demanded more than power. He demanded worship. In the gates where decisions were made and the kingdom's pulse could be felt, he insisted all must bow to him. For most, bowing was simple, a small compromise to survive another day, but Mordecai refused. Esther heard of it, the way a stone thrown into a pond sends ripples far and wide. Mordecai, her cousin, her protector, her hidden connection to who she truly was, would not bend, not to a man, not when only God deserved such honor. His defiance was a spark, and Haman, filled with a fury that knew no limits, threw oil onto the fire. It was not enough to punish Mordecai alone. No, Haman sought to annihilate every Jew in the empire. The edict was swift and ruthless. Sealed with the king's own ring, it was sent to every province. The Jews were to be destroyed. Men, women, children. On a single day, across the empire, blood would flood the streets. And the law, once written in Persia, was irrevocable. Esther received no invitation to the king's councils. She did not sit in on the discussions of policy or war. She was a queen, but not a ruler. And yet, within her rooms, as the news seeped through stone and cloth, she could feel the storm rising. Her people, her blood, had been marked for death, and here she sat, crowned and powerless, in a palace that would not save her from what she was. She was still a Jew. No matter how many perfumes anointed her skin, no matter how many jewels graced her hair, she was one of the condemned. But no one knew, no one except Mordecai. And Mordecai sent a message. He tore his clothes. He covered himself in sackcloth and ashes. He stood in the open streets crying out when it was forbidden to show grief near the palace. His anguish could not be hidden. It reached Esther's ears like a trumpet blast, cutting through the walls meant to separate royalty from the reality outside. Through secret messengers, Mordecai pleaded with Esther. Do not think that because you are in the king's house you alone will escape. If you remain silent now, help will come from elsewhere, but you and your family will perish. And then, the words that would echo forever. Who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? For the first time since she had entered the palace, Esther faced a choice greater than survival. She could continue hiding, continue protecting herself under layers of Persian silk and forgotten identity, or she could step into the light and risk everything. Silence had preserved her life thus far, but now silence could cost her soul. The throne was not hers by right. It was not hers by desire. It was hers by providence, a fragile, burning opportunity wrapped in fear. Esther felt the weight of it in every breath, every heartbeat, every step echoing across the palace corridors. She was a queen, yes, but in this moment she was also a warrior, armed not with sword or shield but with a terrible choice. She did not move immediately. She fasted. She wept. She waited. She sought not the counsel of men, but the counsel of heaven. The silence inside her grew deafening. Not a word from God, not a sign in the sky, only the oppressive, soul-wrenching stillness that always comes before the moment the world shifts forever. In the heart of Persia, beneath the glitter of gold and the emptiness of thrones, a young woman was deciding whether history would remember her, or whether fear would silence her forever. For 3 days, Esther chose silence, but not the silence of fear. It was the silence of preparation, of laying everything she had, her crown, her title, her life, at the feet of the unseen, God who had carried her this far. In the grand empty chambers of the palace, where golden columns stretched like lifeless trees into the heavens, Esther fasted. She refused the rich foods laid before her. She turned away from the perfumes and the royal tutors. She wrapped herself, not in the silks of Persia, but in the raw, aching surrender of a soul ready to step into death if it meant fulfilling her purpose. Outside the palace walls, the Jews of Susa did the same. Across dusty courtyards and narrow streets, the people who had once sung songs of Zion now wept and cried out in despair. No army would come for them. No earthly king would save them. Their hope rested on a woman hidden behind marble doors, a woman who had every reason to remain silent and every reason to walk away. But Esther had already made her decision deep in the hollow places of her soul. She would not walk away. She would walk in. The choice was staggering. Esther understood the rules of the court better than most. No one entered the king's inner court without being summoned. To do so was to invite immediate death unless the king extended the golden scepter in mercy. Even queens were not exempt. Even those favored ones could be discarded in a breath. Xerxes was a man of moods, of sudden and unpredictable rages. One miscalculation, and all she would leave behind was a broken body and a cautionary tale whispered among the palace maids. But Esther also knew something deeper, something that had been stitched into her spirit by the long suffering of her people. There comes a moment when survival must bow to calling, when living another day is not worth the price of silence, when destiny demands more than endurance, it demands courage. She dressed carefully for the day she would face death. She did not choose mourning rags or the plain robes of the oppressed. No, she chose royal robes. She adorned herself not as a victim, but as a queen. Every jewel, every fold of cloth a declaration. She was not approaching the throne as a supplicant, but as one who bore a purpose greater than the king's pleasure. The walk to the throne room was long, longer than the corridors themselves. It's stretched through every fear she had ever known. The fear of loss, of exposure, of failure. Each step was a rejection of self-preservation. Each heartbeat thundered with the reality that she might not walk back. The doors loomed before her, massive and gleaming, etched with the emblems of power she was about to confront. She hesitated for a breath, feeling the crushing weight of history pressing against her small, determined frame. And then she moved. Beyond the doors, the king sat high upon his throne, encircled by advisors and guards. The air was thick with incense and unspoken expectations. As Esther entered, a hush rippled through the room. All eyes turned to her. An interruption, an anomaly, a boldness that smelled of death. The king's gaze lifted. For one agonizing second, nothing moved. No word passed his lips. No gesture betrayed his thought. And then he extended the golden scepter. Mercy. Life. The king's favor had not abandoned her. But Esther knew that mercy alone would not save her people. She needed more than permission. She needed a plan. She bowed low, the royal silk brushing the polished floors. But her mind was sharp, her heart steady. She would not blurt her request into the charged air of the court. She would not accuse or plead where pride and power ruled. Timing would be her ally, wisdom her shield. She invited the king and Haman to a feast, a subtle move, a quiet gathering, a trap not yet sprung. Esther returned to her chambers that evening with trembling hands, but a soul fortified by something greater than fear. She had crossed the threshold of death and been allowed to stand. But the true battle had just begun. Across the empire, the decree of death still hung like a sword above her people. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers looked to the heavens with hollow eyes. And the hidden queen, the silent warrior, prepared her next move. Because standing in the throne room was not enough. She would have to speak. She would have to expose the darkness that lurked in the very heart of the palace. She would have to gamble not just her life, but the fragile hope of thousands on the power of truth spoken at the right moment. The first battle had been won, the battle against fear. But the war for her people's survival raged on, and Esther, the orphan girl turned queen, would not shrink back. She had come to the palace for such a time as this, and now she would not waste her hour. The night before the banquet, the palace hummed with unseen tensions. Behind the music and the heavy aroma of spiced meats, behind the glitter of gold and polished marble, danger rippled just beneath the surface. Esther walked the halls in silence, a figure of poise among the festivities, but inside her chest, her heart pounded with the knowledge of what was at stake. She knew that this feast was not just a meal. It was a battlefield disguised in silks and wine. The enemy sat smiling across the table, unaware that his plans would soon unravel, not by sword, not by rebellion, but by a woman's courage sharpened, by faith. When the king and Haman entered the feast, Esther greeted them with the grace expected of a queen. She poured their wine, served their food, and concealed her war beneath the layers of hospitality. To anyone watching, she was the perfect hostess, the perfect ornament of the Persian Empire. But within her spirit, a storm raged. Every glance at Haman, every glance at the king, was a reminder of the millions of lives balanced on the edge of her words. Timing was everything. One misstep could doom them all. One moment of hesitation could leave her people to be erased from the earth. The first banquet ended without revelation. Esther had held her tongue, waiting, sharpening her resolve. It wasn't time yet. Trusting the whispers of wisdom rather than the screams of fear, she invited the king and Haman to a second feast. Another night to tighten the tension, another night for heaven to prepare the heart of the king for what must be spoken, another night to step closer to destiny. The second banquet began like the first. Wine flowed, laughter masked suspicion, and the golden light of the palace glinted off the jeweled goblets. But beneath it all, the atmosphere had changed. The king grew curious, even impatient. What was this queen hiding behind her soft smile and delicate words? What request could be so grave that she would risk her life to approach him unbidden? His curiosity was a net, and Esther with steady hands was tightening it. At last, when the feast reached its height, the king asked again, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you, even to half the kingdom." The room held its breath. Esther rose, her heart a thunderstorm in her chest, and in that moment she did not speak as a subject or a beauty in a crown. She spoke as a daughter of Israel, as a voice for the voiceless, as a warrior clothed in royal robes but armed with truth. "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king," she said, "and if it pleases the king, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request." The king blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "My life? My people?" The words echoed off the marble walls, shattering the fragile illusion of safety. Esther's voice grew stronger, steadier. "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, I would have remained silent, but no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." The king's face darkened, his fists clenched. Rage surged through him, not at Esther, but at the audacity that someone would dare threaten the life of his queen, the dignity of his reign. "Who is he? Where is he? The man who dared to do this?" Esther turned, her gaze steady as steel, and pointed not to a foreign enemy, not to a nameless traitor, but to the man sitting at the king's own table. "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." The room exploded into chaos. Haman's face turned ashen, his mouth opening in silent horror. The king rose furious and stormed into the palace gardens to gather his thoughts. Haman, desperate, fell to his knees before Esther, begging for mercy, grabbing at the folds of her garments. In that instant, the king re-entered, and saw Haman sprawled before his queen. His rage, already boiling, erupted into a final, irreversible judgment. The guards seized Haman. No trial, no more schemes, no more whispers. His fate was sealed by his own pride, his own evil. The gallows he had built to hang Mordecai, Esther's cousin and the defier of his arrogance, would now be his own grave. Justice was swift, justice was public, but the battle was not over. The law Haman had put in place still remained. The king's signet ring had sealed a decree of death, and no law in Persia could be revoked. The Jews were still condemned, their blood still scheduled to stain the streets. Esther knew her task was not finished. Her victory over Haman was only the beginning. She must now save her people entirely, and so once more she approached the king. Once more she stood in the place where women rarely spoke, and even more rarely ruled. She pleaded for the life of her nation. She begged the king to act. Moved by the courage he had witnessed, and perhaps the guilt that gnawed at his heart, King Xerxes allowed Esther and Mordecai to write a new decree. The Jews could defend themselves. They were given permission to rise against their enemies, to fight for their survival. Throughout the empire, the news raced faster than fear. From the towering cities to the desert villages, hope was reborn. On the day appointed for their destruction, the Jews stood ready. They defended themselves, and they prevailed. What had been intended as a day of mourning turned into a day of deliverance. It all began with a choice. A girl without parents, a queen without allies, a woman without an army, and yet with the weapon of truth, timed with wisdom and unleashed. With courage, she changed the course of history. Esther had not been called to comfort. She had not been called to safety. She had been called to destiny, and in the moment when everything hung in the balance, she answered the call. Across the vast empire, from the grand marble cities to the smallest desert villages, the decree of death had already been signed and sealed. The Jews had been living under a shadow, knowing that a date had been set for their annihilation. Fear had soaked into their bones. Families whispered prayers into the cold night air. Mothers held their children tighter. Fathers looked to heaven, wondering if their blood would stain the earth without a fight. But then, something shifted, not by swords drawn early, not by rebellion in the streets, but by a queen's courage and a king's second decree. The new edict allowed the Jews to defend themselves on the day their enemies planned to slaughter them. It was a permission they had not dared to hope for, and with it came something stronger than weapons. Hope. Hope fueled by the knowledge that they were not abandoned, not forgotten, not condemned to die without standing. Across every province, messages flew faster than fear itself, carried by riders on swift horses, letters bearing the seal of the king. What had been certain doom became a battle they were now allowed to face with dignity. In the days leading up to the appointed hour, preparations were made quietly but urgently. Families gathered in small circles, sharpening blades not for conquest but for defense. Elders instructed the young on where to stand, when to move, how to protect those who could not protect themselves. The communities, scattered and often small, drew together with a fierceness born from the knowledge that they had been given a chance, a rare, precious chance, to survive. Esther's courage had ignited something ancient within them, something that oppression and exile had not destroyed, the will to live and to honor the covenant of their ancestors. The day arrived, heavy with expectation and trembling resolve. In every corner of the empire, the enemies of the Jews prepared for slaughter, confident that the weak would fall easily before them. But they were wrong. As the sun rose, the Jews stood ready, men and women alike, elders and youth. Those who had once lived quietly in the margins now gathered their strength. They did not seek vengeance. They sought survival. They did not thirst for blood. They fought to preserve life, faith, and the memory of a people that refused to be erased. The battles were fierce, but they were not one-sided. The Jews struck back against their attackers with a fury that surprised even the Persian soldiers who watched from the sidelines. What was meant to be a massacre turned into a miracle. In city after city, town after town, the enemies of the Jews fell, and the people of God stood victorious. Mordecai, once the humble cousin who had raised an orphaned girl, now stood as a man of great authority, second only to the king himself. He carried not only the power of the empire's signet, but the authority earned through faithfulness and wisdom. As news of the Jews' victory spread, fear fell upon the rest of the empire. Many among the other peoples began to side with the Jews, seeing that the God of Israel was still alive, still powerful, still writing history in ways no earthly king could predict. It was not merely a survival of bodies, it was a survival of spirit. It was a testimony that no decree of man, no edict of hatred could outlast the promises of heaven. In the aftermath, the streets that might have run red with the blood of the innocent instead rang with songs of deliverance. Joy, long buried beneath the ashes of fear, erupted in celebration. Families reunited, communities feasted. The broken-hearted were comforted, and the silent prayers of countless souls rose like incense to the God who had hidden his hand in the folds of history only to reveal his victory at the appointed time. But they did not forget the cost. They did not forget that salvation had come at the edge of destruction. Esther and Mordecai knew that memory was sacred, that the miracle must not be swallowed by the passage of time. And so they established a new festival, a festival of remembrance, a festival of reversal, Purim, a day to honor the God who had turned mourning into dancing, death into life, silence into songs. Every year, when the month of Adar approached, the Jews would gather. They would remember the decree of death and the reversal of fate. They would tell the story of Esther, the silent warrior who dared to speak, and of a people who refused to break under the weight of oppression. They would send gifts of food to one another and to the poor, ensuring that no one would be forgotten, that joy would be complete and overflowing. And through it all, the lesson remained. God's providence often moves in ways unseen through the faithfulness of ordinary people who dare to take extraordinary risks. Victory does not always come by sword or by strength. Sometimes it comes by the trembling steps of a young woman, approaching a throne with nothing but courage, and a heart anchored in something greater than fear. The Jews survived not because they had armies or fortresses, but because they had a God. Who could raise up deliverance from the least likely of places, from an orphaned girl with a hidden name, from a cousin who refused to bow to evil, from a community that, even when threatened with extinction, remembered who they were? They were the unbreakable people, because they were not held together by politics or power. They were held together by promise, by covenant, by a faith that even the mightiest empires could not destroy, and through Esther's story, that faith still speaks, still stands, still saves. Esther never carried a sword, but she won a war. She never commanded an army, but she led a nation to salvation. Her silence was her weapon, her faith was her fire, and her courage echoes still across every generation. You don't have to be born powerful to change the world. You just have to be willing to risk everything for what is right. Esther's voice broke the silence of fear. And now, the question is yours. What will you do for such a time as this?